Anti-Semitism is at a crisis level in the United States. According to the latest FBI hate crimes data, Jews are the most targeted group in America. But why? How did it get to this point? We'll look at the problem at hand and possible solutions in the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the United States. How did we get here, and how do we stop it?
Hello, I'm Lisa Burkhardt Worley. I'm a woman with a Jewish father who died before I was born, so I didn't grow up as a Jew. But in 2014, on a trip to Israel, I felt like God told me, your Jewish father died, but your Jewish roots never died. This has led to advanced schooling in Judaism, and I've learned about the good parts about being Jewish, like the feasts and the festivals. But I've also learned about the trials, like persecution and anti-Semitism. And this issue of anti-Semitism has created a burden in my soul.
So what is anti-Semitism? Here's a practical definition that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance formulated. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities.
I'm standing in front of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Many people only associate anti-Semitism with the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered during Adolf Hitler's regime. But anti-Semitism is on the rise. We've got to learn from history. We cannot let anything like this happen again.
Rosian Zerner is a Lithuanian Holocaust survivor, now living in Dallas, Texas, where she often speaks at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. She is a contributor to her community newspaper and is writing a book on the local history of veterans. She often spends time creating works of art.
So Rosian, when the Holocaust began, you and your family were forcefully relocated to the Kovno ghetto, and you weren't even 6 years old. Do you remember that day?
I remember the anti-Semitism that was extreme, because the anti-Semitism during the Holocaust was really the violence that right now we're still in the word stage in many other places, but at that point violence was in the foreground, and that is where words of violence lead and the brutality begins.
What was survival like there?
Well, we had 700 calories a day of food when it came, and it was not the kind of food you would eat, like frozen potatoes or broth that was water, basically. We had a certain amount of space where we could live in. We had a certain, which was 4 people lived in maybe a 10 by 10. And it was the coldest winter on record in Lithuania. And of course there was no heat, no water, no sewage, no anything else. And the issue was really to stay alive. My parents actually were my first rescuers. They risked their own life to save mine. I didn't know what was happening, but they would time the guards that were pacing just to make sure that we didn't escape with the dogs, and there was a barbed wire and there were searchlights, and they timed them to dig a hole under the barbed wire, and they did this so fast because the guards didn't have much time to change their positions, and my parents, every time they went there, risked their lives. So I don't know how many times they had to do to dig a hole. They finally have the hole, and they pushed me through it.
Rosian, there are some people today who say the Holocaust never happened. What would you say to those people?
You lie. I'm here to prove it. You're wrong. And what is your motive in doing this? The sacred life of all those who perished is being, you need to respect that. You need to respect your ancestors, and just as you need to respect my ancestors and those who were the victims of this brutal time in our history.
In October of 2018, a gunman shot and killed 11 and wounded 7 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. According to an October 12, 2021 article by AP News, during the attacks, the shooter was saying, "All these Jews need to die." Meanwhile, at Chabad of Poway in California, April 2019, another gunman stormed into that synagogue on the last day of Passover, shot and killed a 60-year-old woman, and injured 3 others.
While these incidents were 2 of the worst anti-Semitic attacks of violence that have occurred recently in this country, there are many more acts of anti-Semitism that don't ever get recorded in the news.
In 2019, the Antidefamation League reported there were 2,100 anti-Semitic incidents, including acts of assault, violence, and harassment. It was a 12% increase over the previous year. Author and radio show host Dr. Michael L. Brown has been very vocal about anti-Semitism. He's written books on the subject, and on a 2020 episode of his program, The Line of Fire, called Now is the Time for Christians to Stand Against Anti-Semitism, I was taken aback by what is happening on the streets of New York City. I asked Dr. Brown if I could share a segment of this program with you. He said yes, so be prepared. What you see might be upsetting.
I want you to feel the weight of this so you can pray and stand with the Jewish people. In particular, if you're a Christian in the New York area, this is a great time to let your Jewish friends know, hey, we're here with you. We've got your back. Now, I saw some video footage that was posted, absolutely sickening. You wonder why the whole nation isn't alerted to this. But just so you can feel the weight of this, just so you can experience this, I'm just going to read to you from a newspaper report, Antisemitic events, violent events, attacks in New York in 2019. January 8th, a stranger attacks a 13-year-old Jewish girl on the street in Brooklyn, grabbing her neck and slapping her in the face. January 14th, a 19-year-old Jewish man is attacked by a group of teens in Brooklyn. January 17th, a Jewish man walking down the street is randomly attacked. February 17th, the windows of a synagogue in Brooklyn are smashed. March 11th, a man kicks a Jewish woman's stroller in Brooklyn with a small child inside. March 15th, in Brooklyn, a subway poster of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is defaced with a swastika and the message, "Die Jew blank." May 1st, a man chases 2 Jewish teens down the street, allegedly for not moving out of his way. When a man intervened, the person chasing the girls yelled about the Jewish cult and spit at him. May 4th, 4 teens attack a Jewish man in Brooklyn. May 7th, an Orthodox man walking along the street is sucker punched in the head by a stranger. May 12th, a Hasidic man and his 4 young sons are harassed on the street by high school students yelling, "I love Hitler." May 20th. At first, I thought this was the same incident as the one above. This is a report by John Sexton, hotair.com. At first, I thought this was the same incident as the one above, but the details and date appear to be different. 4 men in the car follow a pair of Jewish teens shouting, "We love Hitler." June 1st, a teen on a bicycle came up behind a Jewish man and slapped his yarmulke off his head. June 15th, 2 men drive down a Brooklyn neighborhood at night, threatening and harassing Jews on the street. June 24th, a Hasidic teen is punched in the head and robbed on the street. August 12th, a string of robberies on a Monday morning. All of the victims are Jewish, but police decide the motive was robbery. August 27th, a stranger attacked a Jewish man named Abraham Gopin in Crown Heights, punching him several times and hitting him with a brick. The victim lost 2 teeth in the attack. August 31st, a man leaving a synagogue in Brooklyn is attacked by 2 men with a belt. September 18th, a 24-year-old Hasidic man is attacked in Brooklyn by a group of 4. October 1st, a group of teens break windows in a synagogue during Rosh Hashanah prayers. October 12th, another random attack in Brooklyn. The incident took place on Saturday afternoon. The Jewish man was attacked by a black male riding a bicycle. He crossed in front of the Jewish man on his bike, slapped him, and said, "You dirty Jew." November 9th, a man breaks windows at a Jewish school for girls. November 14th, police arrest an 18-year-old for throwing eggs at Jewish people on the street in Brooklyn. November 20th, a Hasidic man is beaten and stabbed by a stranger.
But these acts of anti-Semitism are not limited to the Hasidic community. Aharon Mendez is a Messianic rabbi at Beth Am Messiah in New City, New York. He tells a story about how he and his team were discriminated against after being invited to a ministry conference.
when we arrived, I had one other person with me initially who was going to help me set up. And we went in, and the security guard had no clue who we were, what we were doing, and where we were supposed to go. We finally found somebody who knew about this expo that was taking place, and yet they didn't know who we were. And once they did find out, they led us to where we were supposed to set up. Now, much to my surprise, that was not in the main expo area where people would have traditional foods and you'd be able to meet and greet individuals from these faiths. But we were behind a veil in a very dark hallway. And this was really shocking initially. What was even more shocking is 30 minutes before the expo began, people began to show up and began to put their purses and belongings, coats, and began to ask if we were the dressing room. Now, they had nothing to indicate that we were representing Judaism, so I brought some menorahs, some shofars, and different things of that nature. But over the course of how the expo began and the course of time, it became very apparent that there was some intentional type of ostracizing of Jews.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that anti-Semitism is on the rise in America, clearly. And what are my experiences? Well, I could just give you three, or three of them are, when I was young, in elementary school, 6th grade, maybe middle school, 7th grade, I remember getting off the bus and 3 boys jumped me and beat me up pretty good. And they were yelling dirty Jew and kike and this kind of thing. I didn't know why. And I went home and asked my parents about it. And that's when I began to really learn about anti-Semitism. It was my first experience with it. I learned that our family lost 66 people in the Holocaust. Later in life, I was working at an aircraft manufacturing company. I applied for a manager's job. I was in my 20s, late 20s, and I was not selected. I happened to see one of the selecting officials who was on the interview panel, and I asked this foreman, is there anything I could do better in the interview? You know, what can I learn from it? And he said to me, we will not hire any effing Jews to be a manager. And you can imagine how that made me feel. I had another experience at the same aircraft manufacturer where another man told me that fast food was invented when Hitler threw the Jews in the oven. So, so I have experienced anti-Semitism, and there's more than that.
Itamar Geldman grew up in a Jewish family near Tel Aviv, Israel. Both sets of his grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and he served in the Israeli Defense Forces. But he relocated to the United States in 2005. He's now married, has a family, and political aspirations.
We have seen a resurgence in anti-Semitism in this country. Have you ever been the victim of anti-Semitism since you've been here?
Yes, I have. I'm not sure that there's a surge. I just think maybe there's, and maybe there is a surge, but it's probably mostly because it's just more available to get information, and people feel free to say uncalculated speech over the internet, or when they think that they're invulnerable, or for online bullying or online saying stuff that just doesn't make sense. A lot of them won't say it out loud, or in some incidents it's either fake news or they took a very small portion of individual and generalize the whole population. And I'll give you an example. So in 2015, I ran for council in my town in Flower Mound, and I got elected. And before I even got sworn in, there was an event, an open house for the senior center for the town. And I went to the event, and again, I haven't even got sworn in yet, right? And there was about 4 or 5 Republicans, unfortunately, that came to me and circled me in the event and said, "You need to resign because you have an accent and go back to your country." And I'm like, well, You know, it's just as me as a Republican, it just hurt to see it and hear it because it's the group of people that I go to events with them. So do I think if the media would be there, they would easily portray it as, oh, you see, white Republicans are anti-Semitic, which is absolutely not true. Mass majority of Americans are not racist. There's no racism. There's no narrative of racism or anti-Semitism. It's just the media that likes to cherry pick events and just generalize the population.
But it still exists. We have to admit it.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think, personally, that has to happen to maybe push it back and to get rid of anti-Semitism?
That's a good question. It exists, but I think if we stop allowing it to become mainstream and push it and brainwash it 24/7, just either ignore some of them, just say, you know, it is what it is. There's always going to be racism. There's always going to be anti-Semitism. I really think that the percentage of the population that are think like that, it's so small that we shouldn't even give them the time of the day. In the media, we shouldn't publish them. We shouldn't increase the awareness for that. Either ignore them and then just educate them.
Joining me in the studio is Dr. Greg Stone. He's the pastor of Jewish Ministries at Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas. And we've just heard interviews with Aharon Mendez, with Greg Rosenberg, Itamar Geldman, and of course we saw the video that Dr. Brown showed us. And why do you think it is, Dr. Stone, that people do not know about anti-Semitism and they're not doing anything about it?
Well, that's a great question. I think really I was surprised not that long ago. I got to listen to a presentation of a survey of 1,000 evangelical preachers and born-again Christians, self-described. That's how they describe themselves. And if you ask them, they will, about 60% of them will say that they believe that anti-Semitism is a sin. But the vast majority of them do not see anti-Semitism as a social justice issue.
But a lot of people also date the anti-Semitism back to the Holocaust, don't they? And that's not true. It goes back even further than that, doesn't it?
Oh, it goes way earlier than that. Really, we should talk about the Holocaust and where the Nazis got it. They got it from Luther. You know, Luther's a hero in much of the church world, but he wrote a book on Jews and their lies. And he talked about 7 things that should be done to Jewish people. And really all the Nazis did was implement Luther's advice. He said things like, burn their synagogues and take their homes. Well, that's what the Nazis did. He told them to burn their prayer books. He told them to forbid their rabbis from teaching, and if they do, to mutilate them. Wow. And you can go back earlier than Luther. You know, if you go back to the 2nd century BC, you've got the story of the Maccabees with Hanukkah. And really what Antiochus Epiphanes did, he was the bad guy in the story. What he actually did was he said, we'll leave you alone, we'll let you live if you just don't practice your Judaism. And so it's an attack against the religion, not necessarily against the people. Just don't practice. And so he told people, if you eat pork, we'll let you live. And for example, there's a story in the book of Maccabees where the mother had 7 kids, and one by one, he gave them the opportunity to eat pork, and when they wouldn't, he would break their fingers, their hands, their arms, and just one after another, all 7, and then finally the mother, because they insisted upon keep practicing their Jewish faith. That's really the story behind Hanukkah, behind Hanukkah. But if you go back earlier than that, go back to the 6th century BC and the story of Purim. And there you got the story of Haman, and he said, I don't care if you practice your Judaism or not. We're just going to kill you. So Hanukkah is an attack against the religion of the Jews, and Purim is an attack against the person of the Jew. And then you can go back earlier than that, you can go to Moses. And most people think of, Exodus and the Pharaoh, and they think that's a story of the beginning of anti-Semitism. But actually, the Jews had already been enslaved for 400 years by the time that Moses was setting them free. And so you got to go back way before then. And I would say that obviously, it's kind of obvious that God had a plan of salvation, and Jesus is the key to that, right? And so you really want to know, where did it start? It started when God said, I've got a plan of salvation. And so right there is where anti-Semitism starts.
Well, thanks, Dr. Stone, for being with us. And you have such great insight, and you're also an expert in this field, so we really appreciate your being on this documentary. Anti-Semitism is a way of life for some people, and I asked Dr. Jen Rosner, who's Jewish and holds academic posts at Fuller Theological Seminary, the King's University, Azusa Pacific University, and the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, about the false propaganda that is being circulated concerning Jewish people.
It's definitely an interesting and pervasive question, and very relevant, about cultures where anti-Semitism just seems to be a way of life or ingrained in particular paradigms. And I think that it's not so easy to change that. So I think one of the most effective strategies with regard to that particular issue is to find allies within those cultural contexts who will stand up against those in their own kind of circles. So, for example, if we're talking about extremist Islam, with these certain tropes about the Jewish people in the state of Israel, to find Muslims who disagree with that and who are willing to push back against that. And they exist. They do exist. And I think those partnerships can be very fruitful and very effective in showing that there's a different narrative.
There is always hope. Over the last few years, the New York City Commission on Human Rights decided to fight anti-Semitism. The commission launched a citywide public education campaign to send a message that Jewish New Yorkers belong here. Anti-Semitism does not. I spoke with the commission's Alicia McCauley.
Alicia, what was the catalyst for creating the public education campaign to fight anti-Semitism?
The catalyst for creating the public education campaign was from around mid to late 2018 into 2019, and really back in 2015 when the election cycle began, we saw an uptick in anti-Semitism and bigotry, and it really sort of came to a head in 2018, and we wanted to create a campaign that showed solidarity with Jewish New Yorkers, that uplifted our Jewish communities, that showcased the diversity of Jewish communities in New York City, as well as reminded people that the New York City Commission on Human Rights stands behind New York's Jewish communities.
How effective was the campaign?
I think the campaign was effective in letting people know that we, as an agency enforcing the New York City human rights law, are paying attention, that we are listening, and that we will not stand down from supporting Jewish communities or any religious community that's facing bigotry.
At 17, I encountered a boy I went to church with who was in seminary at the time, and he was just really confused as to why I had this curiosity and devotion and desire to understand the Jewishness of our Christian faith and what it meant to follow Jesus, who was Jewish. And he asked me, what is it about this Jewish thing with you? Like, I don't get it. And I asked him a question in return, which is very Jewish. And I said to him, what is a tree without its roots? In other words, what is Christianity without Judaism? If Jesus was a Jew, and he was a Torah observant Jew, then that inspires our Christian walk, which Christianity just means a follower of a Christ, and Christ was a Jew.
I also think it's important to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to engaging or stopping anti-Semitism. And so the more that we can think about, I just sort of gave two practical tactics, so finding allies and shining light on anti-Semitic events. The way that we can take ideas like that and sort of cater them to particular situations or particular contexts, whether it be college campuses or legislation or personal sort of dinner party anti-Semitism, and also kind of always thinking creatively. And there's tons of resources out there on how to think about engaging anti-Semitism in all of these different contexts, and just sort of remember that we're not alone as we do so.
So we have to attack anti-Semitism at the root of which it begins, and it is a spiritual problem. It is an irrational hatred, but it is also a spiritual hatred. And that can only be changed by having a changed heart towards God's people, the Jewish people, no matter how they may seem to be dead set against Yeshua being the Messiah.
And we need to realize that a historical anti-Semitism or a religious anti-Semitism or just a right or left-wing anti-Semitism has no place in the United States. This is a country based on liberty and freedom for all. Where are we?
One practical solution to ending anti-Semitism is to refute any false information circulating about Jews. We can do that with programs like this and other documentaries sharing the truth. We can also have a practical discussion with our Jewish friends and ask how we can better respect the Jewish people. We should stop participating in cruel, stereotypical jokes about the Jews, and we should pay attention to what the Bible says about this chosen race. In Genesis 12:3, God says, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." In Deuteronomy 7:6, it's clear that the Jews are God's chosen people, a special treasure, so we need to treasure our Jewish brothers and sisters. And then there's the Shema, so important to both Christians and Jews alike. The command to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. But Jesus said there was another commandment every bit as important, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself.
Is anti-Semitism or any kind of prejudice loving our neighbor? No. It's time to break old habits, to love and not hate, and once and for all, put an end to anti-Semitism.